Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, an in-depth look at vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, and civil liberties in the COVID era.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
Welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show. This is Canada's most irreverent talk show here on True North. For our weekend shows, we try to shake things up a bit and do a deep dive into some of the big issues that we talk about on the show and some other fora, and bring in some other voices to really delve into the implications of them. And this weekend, we're going to do something very timely, which is talking about the vaccine mandate that Justin Trudeau's government just announced a couple of days ago, requiring federal public servants to be vaccinated, even if they're going to be working from home, and also anyone wanting to travel by rail or travel by air. So we're going to talk about the implications of this legally, culturally, insofar as Canada's efforts to vanquish the pandemic are concerned. And I have a great team of people that have joined me to tackle this. We've got Anthony Furey, True North contributor and also host of the fantastic post-media podcast Full Comment. We've got John Carpay, the president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and also Aaron Wudrick, who's the director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Domestic Policy Program. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. Great to talk to you all.
Great to be here.
Be with you.
I want to talk to you about this first, Aaron, because this is from a policy perspective. Before we get into some of the legal aspects of it, a fairly concerning development. You've got the public sector union that represents the federal government employees saying that they had 1 day to weigh in on this. And despite the fact that the Liberals were campaigning on a similar program to this for several weeks in the election, it seems like no one really planned it all that thoroughly.
Yeah, it's disconcerting to have a program that's going to have such a huge impact on so many people's lives, and you don't really see any evidence that the government has consulted anyone, never mind the chief stakeholder involved, right? I mean, this is a government that usually pays close attention to the public sector unions. Some would argue that they're a little too cozy, and yet in this instance, you even see the unions themselves saying, well, nobody even bothered to get any input from us. So I think it's more evidence that this is a policy that's sort of written on the back of a napkin. It's not well thought out. They've made a sort of very broad emotional case about the need for a vaccine mandate, but they haven't thought about any of the details or the implications or the needs for simple things like exceptions, which virtually every other mandate and sort of rules around vaccinations for particular places has. They have not really seemed to put much thought into it at the federal level, and that's really disconcerting.
Yeah, let's talk about that, John, because we know that exemptions have been a key part of vaccine mandate discussions for several weeks and months now. The Liberal government has said that they're going to be very rare, very narrow, and very onerous for people. So they're trying to preempt against folks trying to just get a doctor's note or some religious exemption here, which in and of itself seems to be a bit of a concerning priority. But also the lack of accommodation on, even allowing someone to work from home. So the fact that they've specified here that even if you work from home, you're a remote worker, you're not going to be in the office, you're going to have to be vaccinated to keep your job. It sounds like by design, they're not granting people much latitude here.
Indeed, it does sound like that. And the legal aspect and the science are meshed in together. You cannot separate them because under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, governments can, in fact, violate our rights and freedoms. However, the onus is on government to justify it. So the Charter Section 7 right to life, liberty, security of the person very clearly includes a right to bodily autonomy that's been upheld repeatedly by the Supreme Court of Canada and others. What you get injected into your body is a personal, private decision, and it is a charter right to not be injected with a substance. Not only does that mean that the government cannot physically force you by, taking four guys and holding you down on the floor and injecting you, not only a forced vaccination like that, but even a mandatory vaccination where there's very clear, very direct pressure like job losses. The government, it's a violation of the charter right to bodily autonomy. So the government will have the onus in court of proving that this pandemic really warrants this kind of a response. And I know that's been the government's propaganda machine, which is the mainstream media, the government-funded media, has been saying for the last 18 months that, this is on par with bubonic plague or the Spanish flu of 1918. But the truth, the reality, based on government data and statistics, is that this virus and even the variants of this virus do not warrant this kind of a draconian violation of charter rights and freedoms.
Thank you, John. I want to turn to you on this, Anthony. We're talking about the federal government's mandate here. Other municipalities are doing it, notably Toronto. Crown corporations that weren't immediately under the federal government's vaccine mandate have been encouraged to follow suit. I think I saw CBC is planning something along these lines. There's a cultural thrust behind this that I almost think is more concerning than the legal and political action here, in that a lot of people seem to welcome this. Remember, Justin Trudeau was campaigning on this and won an election, however narrow a mandate it was. He won really wedging conservatives on this, of making them out to be the crazy ones for thinking that your employment shouldn't be contingent on whether you're vaccinated.
There's absolutely a cultural component to this, Andrew, and a sense of positioning and political positioning and going with the right narrative or the right trends. And it's really alarming. And one of the things that I've been lamenting for quite some time now is that Canada, and I would say Ontario in particular, is in something of an information silo in terms of how we typically think of ourselves as very cosmopolitan people. I mean, people in Toronto are just, always patting themselves on the back for having that sort of, attitude towards life and the world and news gathering. And yet right now we are incredibly ignorant of what's going on in other jurisdictions and all across the world. How are vaccine passports being rolled out in other jurisdictions? Well, whatever you think of vaccine passports in general, do you support them? Do you oppose them? So many other countries, which in the past we would look to them for best practices, or in the case of the Northern European countries, we're told you must be more like those social democratic nations. We find that in France, for instance, their vaccine passport, well, what do you got to do to get a green light on it? Well, prove that you've had 2 doses of this vaccine. Okay, that's what we have here. Or prove that you've had natural immunity, that you have had COVID somewhat recently. It's either 90 days or 6 months, somewhere in that time window. Or show that you have taken a negative test recently, whether it's in the past 7 days or past 3 days, whatever it is. So there you go. It's much more broad-based, and it's not just about we have to get this 100% or what have you vaccination rate, but it seems more geared towards moderating things and making things work as a society. So many countries are doing this, and yet Ontario in particular, but other provinces, really going with perhaps the most severe best practices approach you can find based on pretty much anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and one I'd want to put to you, Aaron. I mean, do you find that throughout the pandemic, either with this mandate or even other policies, that the Canadian government has been trying to look and learn from the experiences elsewhere? I recall in one case, I think it was the hotel quarantine case, the government said, oh, no, we could have done things as harshly as Australia did, but we didn't. But generally speaking, I don't know if there is much of a consideration of these best practices, as I think Anthony termed them.
Yeah, not at all. And I go even further and say that even within provinces, you don't see them looking at each other. I mean, sometimes you look at schools in Ontario as another example. You had other provinces which kept schools open during the entire first couple of waves, and there was no severe problem in schools. And yet in Ontario, Doug Ford and others talked as if they left schools open, it would be akin to murder. So I think, to be fair, this is a problem that afflicts Canadian policy on a whole range of issues and not just the pandemic. It's as if we're the only country in the world and we're not supposed to look anywhere else for any lessons, things like healthcare. And if we do look anywhere, it's only to the United States and only for bad examples, right? Which is why when you get into things like debate about healthcare in this country, the only answer a lot of defenders of the status quo have is, well, at least we're not America. Well, there are 200 other countries in the world, including some of these countries that, like Anthony points out, that we're often supposed to be mimicking in other policy areas. A lot of them have 2-tier healthcare systems, which get better bang for their buck and better outcomes than Canada, but we're not allowed to talk about those. We're only supposed to talk about the American system. So I think it's a big problem. And I think I would just say the other thing that's been missing in these, in most sort of COVID debates, if you can even call them debates, because they're mostly just sort of declarations by governments that we have to take the most extreme position, is a sense of proportionality. I certainly don't take the view that COVID's a hoax. I believe it is high risk to a certain group of people, and I think it needs to be taken seriously. But there is no real weighing of the cost benefit of a lot of these policies. I think the benefit is overplayed and the costs are downplayed, and there is a lot more cost to, in a lot of ways of these policies than politicians are comfortable discussing.
No, I think you're bang on there, and I will say I'm not a lawyer. You're a lawyer, Aaron. John, you're a lawyer as well. What I do understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, John, is that if the government is going to infringe on your constitutional rights, they're going to invoke Section 1 and apply what they say are reasonable limits, the infringement has to be as narrow and targeted as possible. And that's, first off, do I have it right? And secondly, that's not what's happening here.
I agree entirely with Aaron. I mean, COVID is real and it is a serious threat to a certain demographic, particularly, for example, if you are 85 years old, you're in a nursing home, you've got cancer, heart disease, emphysema, you have serious comorbidities, COVID will shorten your life. And so, it's real, but whenever a government violates charter rights and freedoms, proportionality is part of it. And you have to weigh the benefits against the costs and the harms of your policies. There was a report coming out of Simon Fraser University within the past 6 months. I think it's a Dr. Allen, but I might not have the name right. But he said that the lockdown measures have cost at least 3 times as many lives as what has been saved, at minimal, and possibly 10 times, 20 times. So that's the kind of scientific research that governments seem to be ignoring. And the past 18 months has just been this badgering propaganda that lockdowns are the only solution, lockdowns are saving lives, and now vaccines are the only solution. And it's so detached from science and even from that spirit of humility where you would say, well, you know, what is the truth? What is the data? Let's look at the data. Let's have a cost-benefit analysis. There's not a single province in Canada that, to my knowledge, has actually conducted an open-ended cost-benefit analysis of lockdown measures.
Well, there's been some wordplay here, too. I note, going back to Justin Trudeau's announcement on this and some of the rhetoric he used in the campaign, that you have a choice to not get vaccinated, but you don't have a choice to get on the plane if you're not unvaccinated, or to get on a train, or to go to an office. And when you're threatening people's employment, when you're taking away their mobility rights in effect within Canada, this isn't really a choice.
No, it reminds me of a scene in The Godfather where they're talking about well, my father made him an offer he couldn't refuse, and I said, well, what was that? And he said, well, my father said, I'm going to count to 10. And when I get to number 10, either your signature or your brains are going to be on that contract. Well, technically there was a choice there, but it's not fair to call it a choice. If you've got a gun to your head, you can no longer support your family because you're going to lose your job. That's not a choice in any meaningful sense of the word. When you're threatening job losses, or threatening that you cannot get on an airplane, you cannot leave the country effectively. Those are not choices.
So this is an important point, and this is something I saw a couple of people bring up online, and I want to go to you on this first, Aaron. Right now, the Canada-U.S. border is closed. Now, no Canadian has a right to enter another country. That is something that we accept that other countries can set out their own policies on. But you do have a right as a Canadian to leave the country, assuming there's somewhere else to go. The land border with Canada and the U.S. is indefinitely closed. It's up for renewal, I think, on October 21st. As of this point, the only way you can, and there's no land border anywhere else, so the only way you can go outside the country, apart by, swimming across the Atlantic or Pacific, I guess, is to take a plane or take some commercial vessel, both of which are going to now have this vaccine mandate. So is there a constitutional argument that could be applied here that Canadians are being denied the right to leave their country because they can't get on a plane and there's no land border to cross?
I think that the factors, absolutely, given the rules in place now, your mobility rights have effectively been abolished in this country, and I think that there's a very, very high bar for the government. As John says, the government has the right. Our rights are not absolute; they have the right to curtail our rights, but the onus is on them to explain why they are doing it, and that they are doing it in a way that is minimizing the impact. And they have not even engaged in that analysis. And that, to me, just speaking broadly about that issue, that's the most fascinating thing to me is, I think many people would be, they could be convinced on things like vaccine mandates or passports, but the government needs to make the case about the specifics. And they're not, they're just sort of asserting that this is what we're going to do. And if you question it, then you don't care about people dying. And I think that's extremely disconcerting that even legitimate concerns raised, for example, people who might want to get vaccinated but can't, if you're going to treat those people identically to people who might not want to, I don't think that's justified at all. And it's just really disappointing that there are so many, and we know this from public opinion surveys, that a lot of people seem to be in favor of vaccine passports and mandates, and the justification seems to simply be that because it makes me feel safer, and that the ends justify the means. They're not concerned about the details and the evidence. They're just, if it makes me feel safer, I'm not really too concerned about other people's rights being violated. And that's really troubling to me.
Have you been witnessing this as well, Anthony, when you look around and hear what people are saying here, that there seems to be this idea that we have a right to feel safe, not to be safe, but a right to feel safe, and that all of these measures, if they make us feel safer, are therefore justified?
I'll never forget an email I got from a reader a few months ago, where I guess I complained about a rights violation, and someone wrote in and said, "Oh, give me a break. Name a single right that has been violated. This is all being done because we are in a pandemic, because people are dying. All these actions are necessary." And we go, well, hold on a second. Step back. Maybe you believe everything that has been done is necessary. Maybe you're one of those COVID zero people who wants even more done. But there are rights violations going on. In fact, pretty much most rights are being violated right now. You're just saying you are okay with that. And I think that's the sort of discussion, that's the question people need to ponder over themselves. Yes, many rights are being violated right now. And to the point of Aaron and John, maybe, those, it can be overruled and various sections can talk over each other and make it work and so forth, but it is happening, and you cannot deny it's happening. And that's where, I think it was Aaron brought in the proportionality issue. That's where we really need to sit down and talk about the fact, okay, is it really such that people need to lose their jobs, or people need to be, tackled by police if they don't wear their mask in this one circumstance or not? Or should the person get a fine like one would, when you don't pay your parking and it lapses and so forth? Let's talk about that proportionality.
Yeah, and I want to ask you as well, Anthony, because my theory, and I'm open to being challenged on this, but my theory was that Justin Trudeau is trying to make as broad a vaccine mandate as possible because it's the closest that the government can really get to mandatory vaccination for the general population. So you do one that applies to as many people as possible: air travelers, train travelers, public servants, people that work from home for the public service, the janitors that go into government buildings on contract, because that's sort of the closest they can get to a mandate under the legal means available. But I also realize that sounds moderately conspiratorial, but plausible at the same time.
No, I don't think it's conspiratorial at all, because we have a de facto mandatory vaccine, and that if you wish to participate in society in the way one would have pre-pandemic, you cannot anymore unless you are not vaccinated. So a mandatory vaccine to live your life. Of course, you can navigate the situation. And let's be honest. I mean, this is clearly, there were science fiction novels written about, people who go rogue and, live under the radar of society to avoid these odd rules and so forth, and they make it work, but they're, part of this different code of folks living underground. And we can all laugh at those books that were written, but it is a similar situation. I mean, we have all heard the stories of people who, for instance, were running the illegal barbershops back when things were shut down, visiting people's homes when they weren't supposed to. That was a thing that happened. Right now, there are places clandestinely messaging each other saying, okay, I'm a restaurant. I know I got to do the vaccine passport thing. I guess if you present it to me, I'll accept it, but I'm not bothering people about it. And there's one or two places in the media that are making a big show of it, and some of them have lost their liquor licenses for it. But there are many more that are doing it, and they're sort of talking off the grid with each other in their communities, and it's a whisper campaign and so forth. I mean, it's really quite something to see this happen. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was adamantly against vaccine passports before he was in support of it. I find it funny that to say now, oh, I don't support these passports is, I don't know, quasi-conspiratorial, even though the very people implementing them were fervently against them before. And Doug Ford was quite a prophet when he said this would create a split society, because, well, he has created a split society by forcing people into these choices, navigating this landscape.
Yeah, and I'll go to you as the token Albertan on the panel here, John, because Jason Kenney, very similar thing, was the last holdout. I mean, I guess Saskatchewan and Alberta were the last holdouts on opposing vaccine passports, and then Jason Kenney a couple of weeks ago puts this in, but again, doesn't call it a vaccine passport. And when we talk about the wordplay here, he says it's a restrictions exemption program. So if you're a business, you don't need to have a vaccine passport. You could also close. But if you're open, this is what you have to do to get out of it. And I think your point about the offer you can't refuse is a valid one here, where it's the illusion of having a choice.
Yeah. When I think Andrew made a very important point, that there's a difference between saying that no rights have been violated versus you're okay with the rights violations. Those are two very different positions. I really think it's not. It's almost beyond debate that, in fact, the government measures do restrict our charter freedoms to move, to travel. Entering and leaving a country freely is one of the hallmarks of our liberal democracies, of a free and democratic society. You can enter and leave and enter and leave. And sure, having to carry like a normal passport, not a vaccine passport, it's a minor restriction, but governments can regulate these rights. This is not just regulating a right. This is taking away the right to enter and leave Canada freely, and all kinds of civil liberties to associate freely with your business when you patronize a business. I could go on and on. These are rights violations. We can have a debate on whether they're justified or not. But what we have now in Alberta and everywhere is, I would call it medical apartheid. And we have first-class citizens and second-class citizens. And your first-class citizen, if you've been vaccinated the requisite number of times, and don't think for a minute it's going to stop at 2. In Israel, they've now mandated your vaccine passport is not valid until you've had your 3rd shot. So 2 years from now, Canadians, your vaccine passport will not be valid unless you've had the 7th shot to deal with the 2nd wave of the 5th variant, whatever. Government will be mandating injections once every 6 months. And if you choose not to get that 7th injection, your passport will not be valid and you will be a second-class citizen. And so it is in many ways similar to the racial apartheid that was in force in South Africa, where you had to have the correct papers. If you were not a white and you wanted to work in a white zone, you needed your legal official papers to be allowed to be there. Otherwise, it was a whites only zone. And now we have zones all over the place where only vaccinated people are allowed to go.
One of the big concerns that I have, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, Aaron, is that government does not do temporary. Government does not set up temporary infrastructure very well at all. When we were hearing even about the federal vaccine passport for international travel, the government was saying, yeah, we'll come out with one in December of 2021 that will last about a year until we get a permanent one in place. I'm like, well, hang on, we're already talking about permanent documentation for the vaccine passport system starting in the end of 2022. Is there a concern that you have that a lot of this infrastructure will outlive COVID, will outlive this particular pandemic?
Yeah, I think so. I worry about the wrong lessons being learned about some of these things. And look, I don't want to, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think a lot of governments plan to make these things permanent, but they end up becoming permanent because the yardsticks move and because governments realize they can get away with it over time. You've seen governments, Anthony had mentioned flip-flopping, and by Doug Ford, Jason Kenney flip-flop, even Justin Trudeau, let's not forget, as recently as the spring said that it would be wrong, to have these, to impose these sort of de facto requirements of vaccination. So they change their mind, and I think they'll change their mind in terms of temporary things. If they think that they can get away with it, odds are they're going to try it again.
Yeah, and one interesting point here, and I know this goes outside of this week's announcement and looks at the bigger picture here, but the poor communications from the government at this at many levels has been noteworthy, from actually masks make things worse to masks are mandatory, border closures are racist, border closures are necessary, we don't want a vaccine passport, we want one, it's up to the provinces, okay, the federal government's going to act. And it becomes very difficult to have any buy-in from the population when, to John's point about third doses, fourth doses, that's a concern I'm hearing from people that were on the fence. They're saying, what's the point if in 3 months I'm not going to be, I'm going to be devaccinated, basically. And I do think that there's not a lot of public buy-in right now to what the government's selling.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like, it's not, I think it's easy to understand why people would be skeptical of government just based on the record during COVID alone. Never mind if you're, and I think something that's often not said is that when we talk about people who are vaccine hesitant, for example, it's not this sort of stereotypical guy who lives in the woods who, with a gun. There are a lot of people, for example, in immigrant communities who come from countries where they don't trust government for good reason. And, to sort of accuse these people of being conspiracy theorists because they're rightly suspicious of authority and just not taking everything for granted, I don't think that that's unreasonable. I mean, look, I'm a vaccinated person. I would like to encourage other people to get vaccinated. And I think governments are within their ambit to be encouraging and to try and educate people in a way, but I do not support coercion, and I do not think the governments can say, oh well, our carrots didn't work, so we're going to get the stick out now. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down.
Yeah, and let me go to you on this, Anthony, because I know that when provinces have announced these passports, they've seen in the immediate days following uptake in vaccination. And there's a part of me that looks at that and says that almost reinforces that it works. It almost legitimizes that method, because there are some people that are on the fence that do not fit in, as Aaron said, to that, anti-vax box. They're just people that haven't gotten around to it. They haven't seen the need to. And when those people get vaccinated because of a vaccine passport, the government tends to claim victory.
Yeah, no, it's quite funny. I mean, if you force people to do something, they will probably do it. That doesn't suggest that you were right to force them in the first place. And I know we've been discussing the degree to which the vaccine mandates are and are not, pretty much mandatory vaccination widespread, but that's the attitude a lot of people feel themselves placed in. I mean, coercion is the phrase. It is interesting when we talk about the public conversation, and I'll slightly disagree with you and Aaron, in that I have found the buy-in to be remarkably high in terms of how the goalposts shift. I mean, the basic premise that if you're going to be polled, do you support vaccine passports, or just, people hanging out at the cafe or the park, running into each other, talking about it, saying, I don't support these vaccine passports. That's really seen as a radical thing to say in Ontario, even though the chief medical officer said exactly the same thing just 2 months ago, even though the premier said exactly the same just 2 months ago, many top officials, many top doctors on television saying the same thing. I happen to think they were right, and I do not support Ontario's vaccine passport system. And it's interesting that that was the mainstream view. I mean, we talk about how culture changes over, 10 years. Remember 10 years ago, you couldn't say this. Now it's 10 weeks, it's 10 days even, how quickly attitudes change. So I would have thought public buy-in for many of these measures there'd be a drop-off percentage. So the more and more severe the rules go, the more and more things get by, the more and more we have nuanced and contextualized information to help us learn exactly who is high risk of COVID and what we can do to assist those persons and so forth. Sadly, I'm not so sure that conversion rate has happened as high as I thought, and public buy-in does seem to me to remain alarmingly high.
No, that's actually fair, and I'd be interested in seeing some polling on this. Do you trust the government? Very simple question, but I feel it might actually pain me to see how high that number is. I don't know if you want to take this, John, or you, Aaron. I'll throw it out to you both, but what recourse is available to federal workers? Can they file a constitutional challenge, or do they have to hope the union takes it up and go through some arbitration process if they want to challenge this policy?
You can take charter violations, you can take to court in the abstract, or you can wait and get a real client. So, as soon as these laws come into force, any person or organization could already take them to court. if you want a more persuasive fact scenario and a better chance of success, it would be somebody that has lost their job and has been fired for not getting injected with the mRNA substance that by the way, has not been subjected to any long-term testing in humans. So it's not there are valid reasons for not getting it. So yeah, federal workers would have to, if they want to challenge it in court, they would need to get fired first. If they quit, you don't really have a legal claim, or certainly not as strong of a legal claim as a situation where the employer says, you are fired and I'm terminating your employment because you are not vaccinated. That gives you a stronger legal foundation to take it to court.
The aspect of this that I wonder is if their whole intention is to put the fear into people and then not actually act on it for that reason, to avoid having to defend against a real challenge. Of course, if news travels that it's a fairly toothless mandate, then that may happen anyway against them. But one interesting point of this, Justin Trudeau was talking about how these are the strongest, most stringent measures in the world. And I never want to be accused of urging the government to do more. But I do find it interesting that for something they're arguing is meant to be so serious, they aren't actually requiring proof, Aaron. They're requiring an attestation. And obviously, they're saying that lying is a disciplinable offense, to use a word that I'm not sure is real. But they're not even going as far as they're saying they're going in some ways.
Yeah, look, you asked the question about whether they're really just trying to spook people into doing something. And I think that's a large part of it. In fact, that's the sort of implicit purpose of these passports. It seems to be that, it's funny when I see people, sometimes online, they'll say things like, well, I feel so much safer now going to a restaurant knowing that there's a vaccine passport. Well, we all know that even vaccinated people there are breakthrough cases and they can still spread it. And you sort of see people who jump into the argument and say, well, no, the real reason is to encourage people to get vaccinated. So I was saying if you're acknowledging that the actual prohibition is not serving a public health purpose, then all you're left with is that it's supposed to be a pressuring device to get people to increase the vaccination uptake rate. So I find that fascinating that the publicly stated reason, we're making it safer in spaces, is not actually defended by anybody who knows anything about the disease. They say, well, the real reason is it's a nudge to people saying, well, you might like going to restaurants, and so we're not gonna make you're gonna take that away from you unless you get vaccinated. That's the real reason behind things like passports.
Well, that bait and switch, though, is very key. And I know, Anthony, you talked about this a while ago in the context of Ontario, where Ontario's government never really thought that lockdowns were helping people or saving lives. It was meant to reduce mobility. They wanted to give people fewer reasons to leave the house. It had nothing to do with whether it was safe to go into a store, nothing to do with whether it was safe to go into any other thing that had been shut down. They just wanted to stop people from moving. But when we talk about the legality of this, you can't all of a sudden start prescribing off-label use of lockdowns, which is, I fear, what, to Aaron's point, this whole thing is as well.
Yeah, and the problem is a lot of these things that were just brought in out of an abundance of caution. A lot of members of the public, even very educated people, took that to mean no, this was actually extremely risky. So you're in a low-risk neighborhood, you're a young, healthy person. If you go to the grocery store sort of without a mask, and if you at all get anywhere close to someone, you're going to get this illness and you're going to very quickly be hospitalized and you're going to die from it. And most of that is just not true, so much so that the federal contact tracing app that Dr. Theresa Tam, I guess, oversaw, that doesn't register contact between people unless you're together, unless you're within 6 feet of each other for 15-minute duration, even if one of those people tests positive for COVID. So if you're standing beside someone at the grocery store for 10 minutes, 10 consistent minutes at the checkout line, and you're 4 feet apart, and that person later tests positive for COVID, you will not get an alert because Dr. Tam is telling you can't really get COVID from them in that situation. And yet at the same time, we're currently in an environment in Ontario where you're going into a grocery store where I know that doesn't have the vaccine passports, but probably 80%, 90% of the people are vaccinated, yet you still have to wear a mask and you're still encouraged to sort of be fearful in that environment, even though it's been established by none other than Dr. Tam herself that you're not really catching COVID.
John, one of the painful realities that we've seen in the last year and a half has been that these restrictions are only ever stacked. They're never removed. They're never taken away. There's never a trade-off. Let's look at airplanes and trains, for example. The government hasn't said, you know what, everyone on every commercial plane in Canada is going to be vaccinated, so masks off. Have a good time. You're going to be able to fly freely. And we've seen this in classrooms as well. Universities in Ontario and elsewhere have mandated vaccination. They've not said, okay, you can take your masks off. And that's where I get very concerned, is knowing that we're not that I think liberties should be traded, but we're not even being given the courtesy of, okay, let's give a little for what we're taking.
Well, liberty has died in the hearts of many Canadians. That's the core problem. And if a love for liberty dies in the human heart, and if it dies in culture, it's pretty hard to, revive it using politics or even the courts. But we're in a very serious crisis where people are still scared. There's no rational basis. I mean, statistically, if you are under 70, you have a greater risk of dying from a car accident than you do dying from COVID. And I could go on and on with all these, death rates in Canada in 2020. If COVID was truly the scary, the Spanish flu of 1918 equivalent, you would have seen a significant uptake in the death rates in Canada in 2020. Well, death rates in Canada in 2020 were very much in line with 2019, 2018, 2017. That's not my opinion. That's simply what Statistics Canada will tell you when you look at the data. But unless and until we can get rid of the unfounded fear, and again, I say unfounded fear, there is a legitimate healthy fear of COVID, that it is real, it is a threat to some people, but there's no basis in reality for the entire population to be scared of this and to be giving up rights and freedoms. But unless and until we can counter this fear, as long as the majority of people are living in a state of fear, they will continue to acquiesce to more and more stripping away. And there's no end to this. I mean, once people accept a vaccine passport for COVID injections, why would they object to government expanding the vaccine passport to other things? Like, we just want to make sure that you have not visited any hateful internet websites. So we just want to see your passport to make sure that in the last 3 months, you have not visited any hateful websites as determined by the government. Are people going to object to that?
I was hoping to end on a cheery note, and then John opened with "Liberty is dead." Aaron, do you have any optimistic wisdom you can close us out on?
Well, look, I would just say that I hope that more and more people start to decouple fear from acting prudently. I think you can take COVID seriously without being scared 24/7. And I think it's unfortunate that, governments seem to have decided early on that the only way to get people to take it seriously was to scare the crap out of them. The problem with that is, of course, it's hard to bring them back, and nothing the government has done since has we've abolished all perspective on this. And I think it's just troubling to me that there are still some people that are living like it's March 2020 in terms of fear, even though we've learned so much since then. And of course, the other danger with that is that, if everything is equally risky, then people start to question every measure. And I think it just undermines the government's efforts. If every single rule is equally important, then people are going to start to say, well, I can't follow 200 rules. I'm going to follow none of them. So I have hope that we will finally turn the corner on this, but it can seem bleak some days.
Aaron Wudrick, Director of the Domestic Policy Program at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thank you for coming on. John Carpay, Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms President, thank you, John. And Anthony Furey of Post Media, Toronto Sun, and do check out his podcast, Full Comment. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for coming on.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Andrew.
That does it for me. Again, if I ever want to end on a cheery note, I can't do a civil liberties topic because I'm inclined to agree with John. There often isn't a lot to be cheery about as far as liberties are concerned in Canada. But that's why we're here. If you can't smile about it, all you can do is cry. So I try to find ways to do the former, hard as it is. We've got to end things there. My thanks to you all for tuning in, and also to John, Aaron, and Anthony for coming on the show. We will talk to you all soon with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Thank you, God bless, and good day.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.